May 8, 1945, a bright day in history that witnessed the world erupting in joy as the war in Europe ended after years of unimaginable terror. But peace was not complete. Far east, the battlefields of the Pacific still echoed with the relentless rage of war, where the Japanese held on, resolved to fight to their last man. The US, meanwhile, waged a strategic tug of war, pushing back the fierce tide of resistance, island by island, in a slow march towards Japan's home territory. A heavy cloud hung over the Allied commanders, particularly the American President Harry Truman. The obstinate refusal of Japan to surrender, even in the face of an inevitable and costly defeat, stood at odds with every military and moral doctrine known. Their stubborn resolve implied a heavy price for the upcoming Operation Downfall. The planned 1945 invasion of Japan carried the potential weight of 1 million American casualties and a catastrophic number of Japanese lives. The grim predictions extended further, suggesting the relentless fighting could bleed into 1946. It was clear that Japan's surrender would have to be coerced at any cost. Before resorting to the cataclysmic power of the atom bombs that would later decimate Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the US attempted a different tactic, less known but no less impactful. An imposing armada, a union of American, British and New Zealand naval forces, took positions across the Japanese coastlines. The fleet unleashed one of the most devastating naval barrages in modern history. Their primary intention was to draw the remnants of the Japanese Air Force out to sea, like bait for a hungry beast. However, the ensuing events would ripple outwards, shaping the war's course in ways no one could foresee. The twilight of 1944 marked a turning point in the grand theater of the Pacific, where the United States waged an arduous and costly island-hopping campaign against the Japanese Empire. Each territorial acquisition took a toll, but the strategic victories successfully began to beat back Japan's military expansion. It began in November as the Mariana Islands, strategically crucial, were wrested from Japanese control, offering the Americans a vital outpost to orchestrate aerial offensives against the mainland of Japan. With the start of 1945, the American forces next set their sights on Iwo Jima, a strategic fulcrum between the Marianas and Japan. Its capture would provide a pivotal staging ground for the American bomber forces, and in a final major prelude to a possible direct assault on Japan, America advanced on the battle-worn island of Okinawa. Over 1,300 ships, bolstered by the formidable British Pacific Fleet, unleashed a relentless bombardment. Yet the Japanese defenders defied the odds, meeting the fierce air attacks from an armada of 40 aircraft carriers and weathering the storm of artillery from 10 battleships and 9 cruisers. As the sun rose on the first day of April, the American forces descended on Okinawa. A grueling war of attrition ensued over a scant 486 square miles of land. The ghost-like Japanese defenders hid deep underground, prolonging the battle into a 3-month standoff. Despite their 2 spirited counterattacks, the tide of war gradually eroded their defense, succumbing to the might of the American military. Yet, the brutal confrontation in Okinawa provided an insight into the ferocious defensive capabilities of Japanese forces and the profound willingness of the Japanese people to defend their homeland at all costs. Okinawa showcased Japanese troops' innovative defensive tactics, such as well-fortified positions in the island's rugged terrain and human wave tactics. These measures led to an astonishing number of casualties on both sides, over 12,000 American servicemen and an estimated 100,000 Japanese soldiers lost their lives. Beyond the military losses, the civilian toll was even more staggering, with estimates ranging from 40,000 to over 150,000, highlighting the stark reality that any invasion of mainland Japan would not be solely a military affair. Moreover, the battle exposed the deeply entrenched cultural and nationalistic fervor and painted a harrowing picture of what American troops could expect if they were to invade Japan. The experience significantly influenced the United States' decision to opt for an alternative, more drastic approach to ending the war. As Japan stood resilient, refusing to yield despite losing all Pacific territories, the Allied forces readied themselves for the monumental task of invading mainland Japan. The envisaged campaign promised brutality and hardship, a daunting prospect even for the battle-hardened American commanders who had already claimed victory by all practical measures. Amid these preparations, a weapon shrouded in secret was unknown to most, including then Vice President Harry Truman. The atomic bomb, a game-changer of unimaginable proportions, remained under wraps. Without the knowledge of this looming, world-changing force, the invasion plan forecasted a ruthless campaign. Haunted by the recent memory of Operation Iceberg in Okinawa, a mere 400 miles from the Japanese mainland, the strategists' expectations were awash with somber hues. The Japanese had altered their approach, retreating to fortified lines and cavernous hiding places within Okinawa's heart, where they waged a fierce 3-month-long resistance. Coupled with waves of aircraft relentlessly targeting US and British Commonwealth ships, the bitter campaign culminated in more than 50,000 US casualties, 250,000 Japanese military and civilians lost, and significant damage to over 400 Allied vessels. In contrast to this stark scenario, Operation Downfall was projected to be even worse. Contrary to the prevailing belief that Japan possessed only 5,500 to 7,000 aircraft and had lost their best pilots, post-war investigations by US occupation forces revealed a staggering count of 12,700 aircraft and an available pool of 18,600 pilots, thanks to the extensive conversion of training units into kamikaze squadrons. The daunting threats extended beyond air power. Japanese defenses bristled with scores of nearly radar-invisible training aircraft due to their wooden frames, thousands of kamikaze speedboats, and a well-preserved fuel stockpile. Though largely comprised of ill-trained conscripts, the Japanese army would have been defending their homeland, fortified and rugged, and supported by a fervent civilian militia prepared to confront American tanks with mere farming tools. Unbeknownst to the Allies, Japan was preparing a fierce defensive operation that would tap into the most fanatical aspects of Japanese psychology to crush the invaders. Operation Ketsugo, translated as Operation Decisive, was Japan's strategic plan to defend its homeland. The fundamental principle of Ketsugo was to inflict such heavy casualties on the Allies that they would reconsider their approach and seek a negotiated peace rather than unconditional surrender. The strategy reflected the determination of Japan's military leadership to fight to the bitter end, despite dwindling resources and manpower. Ketsugo called for the concentration of forces in Kyushu, the southernmost of Japan's main islands, which was expected to be the primary target of the Allied invasion. The Japanese plan involved using remaining naval and air assets for kamikaze attacks against the invasion fleet, and for the civilian population to resist using guerrilla warfare tactics. Japan's ground forces were to be positioned in depth throughout Kyushu, prepared to fight in a war of attrition to maximize enemy casualties. The soldiers were ordered to avoid surrender at any cost, encapsulating the samurai spirit of the Bushido Code. Civilians, including women and children, were also trained and expected to fight, demonstrating the total commitment of the Japanese nation to its defense. The Allies, blessed with air and naval supremacy, could isolate and bombard Japanese troops, sever supply lines, and obliterate the remaining factories. But previous encounters, such as the Battle of the Bulge, reminded them that despite their vast artillery, numerous tanks, and ample ammunition, they could still suffer heavy losses. For President Truman and his generals, the challenge was not the fear of defeat, but the potential duration and cost of victory. By 1945, war-weary America was craving respite from casualty lists, rationing, and unending wartime factory shifts. With the possibility of another year or two of conflict, mounting pressure emerged to find a way to finish the war once and for all. As such, the plan for the invasion of Japan, Operation Downfall, was put into motion. And one of the first steps in the long-winded war campaign was to completely obliterate the Japanese coastal assets with a naval bombardment of unparalleled proportions. In shadowed war rooms, US Navy strategists fiercely argued for a blockade and bombardment of Japan, hoping to choke the life out of its defiant resistance. General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific, with the weight of the war on his shoulders, pushed for an early strike on the island of Kyushu, setting the stage for the final assault on Honshu, Japan's largest island. Admiral Chester Nimitz, sensing the gravity of the moment, found common ground with his army counterpart. By this time, the skies above Japan were darkened by the unrelenting silhouettes of B-29 Superfortress bombers. From their bases in the Mariana Islands, they rained fire and fury upon Japanese cities and industrial heartlands on almost a daily basis. The once bustling trade routes around Japan were now haunted by Allied submarines and warships, severing the nation's lifelines. At the same time, US Navy aircraft carriers operating around Japan had mechanized the deployment of attack aircraft, which swooped in repeatedly, striking at the very heart of the Japanese homeland. Japan could do little to hold back the onslaught. What remained of their once mighty naval fleet was starved of fuel, and it lay dormant in their ports, even as US warships dotted the horizon. Similarly, their air force was now a caged bird, held back on purpose as a last resort defensive tool in anticipation of a full-fledged US invasion expected later that year. Japan now regretted having underestimated the need for coastal artillery before the war, as only a handful of ports in their territory were shielded by guns. To make matters worse, they were mostly antiquated against the modern warships the US was bringing to the battle. The American naval fleet pressed their overwhelming advantages using their swift battlecruisers, which so far had been entrusted to defend US aircraft carriers. But now, with no aerial or naval threat coming from Japan, the fast vessels were ordered to attack Japanese coastal towns and military facilities. During these early skirmishes, the battlecruisers met little to no resistance, and this gave Allied tacticians a bold idea that could just push the Japanese into a fatal mistake. By this time in the war, the US Navy had little use for the massive battleships that had spearheaded the way during the Pacific's island-hopping campaign. Perhaps these capital ships could be used to force Japan into submission. The idea was to set the large Allied battleships and cruisers against Japan's coastal cities in a series of coordinated attacks. Besides damaging the already pummeled coastal towns, the Allies hoped to draw out the Japanese Air Force to lure them into the open skies and into the crosshairs of waiting Allied fighters. But the Japanese had little to lose in the wake of more bombardment, and they saw through the Allies' bluff. The Imperial Central Command, in a display of strategic foresight, resisted the bait. They held their aircraft close, waiting for the Allies to set foot on their sacred soil. The horizon was painted with ominous hues as the US Third Fleet, under Admiral William Halsey, surged from Leyte Gulf in the Philippines on July 1st. Their mission was unprecedented, a direct assault on the very heart of Japan. In the annals of warfare, sending a fleet to the shores of military power would be like a moth flying into a flame. A battleship firing its massive guns was a beacon, drawing every enemy's eye and weapon. History was littered with tales of ships falling prey to coastal defenses, like the German cruiser sunk by Norwegian torpedoes in 1940. With their fierce reputation, the Japanese could still unleash hell on the Allies' most formidable vessels. Yet America believed Japan was unlikely to strike back. The operation was a masterclass in naval strategy. Submarines prowled Japan's waters, seeking hidden naval mines and paving the way for the incoming fleet. Above, B-29 superfortresses and B-24 Liberators scoured the land, ensuring that America would be ready if Japan's air force took to the skies. Vice Admiral John McCain's Task Force 38 struck first. On July 10th, the skies roared with fury as aircraft unleashed chaos near Tokyo. Resistance was scant. By July 14th, their gaze turned north to Hokkaido and northern Honshu, regions so far untouched by war's horrors. It was a brutal awakening for Japan, their first naval assault in a century. Among the American commanders, a fiery debate raged. Some saw Japan's stranded warships as harmless relics, while others thirsted for vengeance. The Third Fleet's might was undeniable, sinking 31 vessels and obliterating 25 aircraft. With Japan seemingly paralyzed, the next phase began. Task Unit 34-81, led by the steely Rear Admiral John F. Shafroth Jr., set their sights on Kameishi in northern Honshu. As they approached, the battleship South Dakota flew a haunting reminder: never forget Pearl Harbor. At 12:10 p.m., the skies darkened with artillery. For over 2 hours, Kamaishi was engulfed in fire and smoke. Yet in this inferno, 3 merchant ships and an escort ship defied fate, weaving through a hailstorm of gunfire and escaping unscathed. The Japanese were caught by surprise and reacted with little organization or discipline, forced to use ineffective anti-aircraft fire against the fleet in desperation. Although most of the shells struck within the ironworks, their explosive concussion triggered fires across Kamaishi. The ensuing smoke obstructed US Navy aircraft from providing support or spotting for the warships, which nonetheless continued to pound predetermined targets. Not a single Japanese plane or coastal gun retaliated. The aftermath revealed the scale of devastation. Kamaishi's ironworks lay in ruins, homes were reduced to ash, and over 400 civilians were lost to the onslaught. The Allies later learned of the crippling blow they dealt to Japan's production. Yet war's cruel irony was evident when they discovered that among the casualties were 5 of their own, prisoners of war caught in the crossfire. As the sun set, the horizon was again painted with the promise of destruction. Task Unit 3482, breaking away from Task Force 38, set its sights on Muroran, nestled on Hokkaido's southeast coast. The night was pierced by the thunder of artillery. From 30,000 yards away, 3 battleships unleashed a storm of 860 16-inch shells. Muroran's industrial heart was shattered, halting over 2 months of vital production. The aftermath revealed that the devastation was far greater than initial estimates, yet this assault was fraught with peril. Admiral Halsey, the mastermind behind the operation, was acutely aware of their vulnerability. A single Japanese aerial sortie could have turned the tide. He later recalled those 6 hours of bombardment as the most agonizing of his life. But the skies remained silent, bolstering the Allies' belief that Japan was biding its time. The psychological scars inflicted were profound. Halsey would later remark, showcasing the audacity of the Allies, "We made no bones about playing in his front yard." The sting of these words was felt deeply in Japan, with their war minister compelled to issue a public apology for their impotence against the Third Fleet's relentless onslaughts. But the bombardments were not over. On July 17th saw a combined British and American aerial assault north of Tokyo. As night fell, Tu 3482, under Rear Admiral Badger, veered off to unleash hell on Hitachi. Despite the shroud of rain and fog, the Allied armada, guided by radar and LORAN, rained down over 1,000 shells on 9 industrial targets. The next day, Tokyo was in the crosshairs again. The prime target was the formidable Japanese battleship Nagato. Yet even with a barrage of 240 shells, the radar station on Cape Najima stood defiant. After their Tokyo offensive, the Allies took a brief respite, gearing up for a relentless 4-day assault on Kura and the Inland Sea. The attacks continued, and the Allies closed their grip on the empire of the rising sun. On July 26th, the United States, Great Britain and China issued the Potsdam Proclamation, demanding Japan's unconditional surrender, or else they would face, quote, the utter destruction of the Japanese homeland. When Japan appeared to reject the proclamation's terms, US President Harry S. Truman and his advisors decided to deploy the first atomic bomb on the Japanese mainland. Hiroshima was leveled by nuclear fire on August 6th. Kamaishi, the site of the first attack, was still reeling from the previous assault when it was targeted again on August 9th. This time the Allied armada was even mightier, bolstered by British and New Zealand vessels. By now, after an entire month of brutal naval bombardments and receiving no resistance from the Japanese, the Allies' confidence was soaring. The skies echoed with the roar of guns as the fleet rained down thousands of shells, turning Kamaishi into a smouldering ruin. This ferocious assault was broadcast live, with the world listening in real time to the sounds of war from the decks of the USS Iowa. Halsey's audacity was evident when he quipped, quote, "By now our contempt for Japan's defenses was so thorough that our prime consideration in scheduling this bombardment was the convenience of the radio audience back home." To make the 9th even more devastating for Japan, at 1 a.m. the Soviet Union abruptly declared war on Japan, and Soviet troops conducted devastatingly swift and massive invasion into Japanese-occupied Manchuria and into southern Sakhalin Island. At 11:02, the B-29 Boxcar dropped an atomic bomb on Nagasaki, the second since the one on Hiroshima on August 6th. The wrath of the entire world seemed to bear down on Japan as World War II reached its blistering climax. While the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are often spotlighted as the pivotal events that forced Japan's unconditional surrender, the reality is that the harrowing conditions that pushed Japan to the limit were a combination of the bombs, the destruction of their navy and air force, the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, and on a lesser extent, the humiliating naval bombardments of their home islands. The bombardments might not have drawn the Japanese Air Force into the fray as the Allies had hoped, but they left an indelible mark on Japan's steel backbone. The vital Kamaishi and Wanishi ironworks bore the brunt of this fury in July and August, their structures groaning under the weight of the onslaught. The Allies' precision was chilling. Their gunnery zeroed in on the coke batteries of the factories, the very heartbeats of continuous production. When the dust settled, post-war evaluations unveiled a stark reality. The devastation wreaked by the 2,000 pounds of 16-inch naval shells was surprisingly less than what could have been inflicted by an equivalent weight of general-purpose bombs from Allied aircraft. This revelation bolstered Vice Admiral McCain's stance that the protective aircraft could have been more destructive than the warships themselves. Yet, the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, weighing the minimal risks to the naval vessels, deemed the bombardments a justified act of war. But beyond the physical scars, the bombardments left deep psychological wounds on the Japanese psyche. For those who had endured both air and naval raids, the naval assaults, with their unpredictable nature and prolonged duration, were the stuff of nightmares. While some factories stood relatively unscathed, their production lines stuttered, plagued by absenteeism and dwindling productivity. The looming silhouettes of Allied warships on the horizon became grim harbingers of a war lost. By 1949, a somber tally emerged. The Japanese Economic Stabilization Agency reported that the naval bombardments and other non-bombing attacks had claimed 3,282 souls, a mere 0.5% of the total casualties inflicted by the Allies on the Japanese homeland. Yet each number told a story, each loss a testament to the horrors of war.